good governance, the importance of parity in the boardroom. We've talked about this a little bit. SIGA's mission is to support sports organizations by inspiring accountability, transparency, and good governance through its universal standards, and to encourage organizations to go through its independent rating and verification tool called SERVs. What we know is that female leadership in sports is a critical component to good governance. Why? Touched on it again. Because when we have women at the highest levels, we have a diversity of thoughts. We have diversity of thoughts and voices. And that yields better decision making in innovation and in business. Yet we know that this industry is still lagging a little bit behind. And that's what this panel is all about. We will be exploring how we can position women for more leadership positions. How do we ensure that this movement is sustainable and not just a little hashtag? We ask, is gender parity realistic? And do quotas trigger meaningful change, or do they lead to tokenism, which is a really important part of this conversation because, Emmanuel, you touched on it. Merit is so important when positioning women to lead. The speakers, Katie, we already know Katie. Anastasia Denias, EVP and General Counsel of Major League Soccer. Olga Harvey, Chief Strategy and Impact Officer of the Women's Sports Foundation. Erica Edwards O'Neill, Senior Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for New York Roadrunners. And moderating this panel is Jill Davison, who is SVP of Global Lifestyle Marketing for MasterCard. Come on up, ladies. Thank you. We need more.
Thank you, Bonnie. Hi. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just going to sit over here.
One more thing before we get the panel. Cassie, I saw you and it reminded me. Please be sure if you're one of our panelists to head to the back and get mic'd up 15 minutes before your panel so you're not scrambling and wondering how people are going to hear you. Thank you.
I don't think there was going to be one more.
Thank you very much, Bonnie. Can everyone hear me? Good morning, everyone. So good governance. What does good governance look like? How do we define it? What are some of the examples? Olga, why don't we start with you?
Thank you, and delighted to be here with all of you. And you know, it's a big question, and at the same time, it's a simple question, right? It's just good governance is a simple set of processes and procedures that's going to lead to equitable outcomes. That should be simple, right? Not so much as we realize in reality, because our biases, our gender norms and other things get in the way of sort of the simplicity of this message. And I've been thinking a lot about it, and there are examples of excellence, but it requires hard work, and it requires intentionality, and it's just not gonna happen by itself. And so I'm gonna highlight two examples for all of you. There are many more, and by no means these are the only companies that do good work, but they come from different industries, and they've committed to good governance in their different ways. And by no means they're perfect either. So one of them is, and the commissioner is actually since then left, but Gloria Nevares at one of the sports conferences, she has openly stated and created the Bill Russell Rule, where it's sort of I guess an improved version of the Rooney Rule that maybe didn't work. But basically, they have openly committed to having a diverse slate for every single position in the organization, from mid-management all the way to the boardroom. And if you're going to have a diverse slate, you're going to end up with diverse candidates. Not always, but certainly your position for success. And the second example I would give is HSBC, where they took it a step further. And they basically said, if we're going to change the composition of our board, not only do we have to have a diverse slate, we're actually going to say it's going to be 100% diverse slate for the time being, because if you're going to add people to your boardroom sort of at an equal level, when you're already behind, you're never going to catch up. And the other thing they did is it has to be based on a skill matrix. So these are not token individuals that check the box, but we're going to have skill matrix that we're going to define, and we're going to find people who meet that. And if they don't apply, we're not going to take that as an excuse. We're going to go ahead and find them, and they've been very successful. So those are just two examples. Again, easy if you fully commit to it from the very top.
My turn?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, right. Everyone, I've sort of monopolized a bit of time this morning, so I'll keep mine short and sweet because I'd love to hear from you both. But the SIGA Universal Standards, I mean, the lawyer in me would define good governance in kind of 4 buckets, and that would be democracy, transparency, accountability, and then on the sports governance side, stakeholder representation. And of that, obviously, we need to have diversity and inclusion on the board to ensure innovation and term limits. So I would say that the SIGA's universal standards, I'd encourage sports organizations to adopt them. We're here to go, everyone's here to go on a governance journey. And we would also encourage to go through our independent rating system, because without that accountability, it's only looking in the mirror and saying, we're fit for purpose, but it's need that accountability to someone else to say, we meet the standards, and to keep on going. So yeah, over to you, Anastasia.
Well, thank you. And sorry for the handheld. I came unprepared for a mic. So it's nice to be here with you all. And I might be jumping ahead a little bit, but I wanted to touch on something that Olga said about a skill-based metric that's necessary when you're hiring and when you've got a diverse slate of candidates. And one of the things I think we all need to be mindful of is when you are starting from behind, I think as you said, you're not always going to have women and other underrepresented groups with the same experience levels, may have the same skill levels. And so I think what Olga said was really important in terms of leveling the playing field, looking for the right skills, and taking a leap of faith and providing opportunities to women and other underrepresented groups who might not have that same experience, because the experience-based tends to look the same. And so I think that was a really important point in terms of good governance when you start breaking down what are the skills necessary to be on this board or to be in this job, as opposed to has this person done this exact job before.
Exactly right. I'd love to jump in there. I think, and one, I'd layer everything that you all said with the notion of equity. And so often we get stuck, I think, with just the diversity question. And if you have equity, you will have diversity, you'll have inclusion. You will be looking to ask those questions about who's not represented, who's not at the table, who might be burdened by our action or inaction, who's benefiting, and who's completely, again, left out of the conversation. So that notion of, if we think about diversity, equity, and even social responsibility as the blanket that goes across and not a separate bucket. It is really a part of every decision, every business decision, all the hiring opportunities. And I love what you stated, Anastasia, is that when we often hire one from either maybe referrals, right, which you'll get a lot of likeness, same experiences. And I give this example. I've been in the DEI space for a very long time. And a few years ago, I was working with a fantastic woman who was looking for someone in real estate. And we had a diverse slate, and she just kept rejecting the slate. And finally, we had to sit down with her, and she said, I want someone who's grew up talking about real estate at the breakfast table. And I was like, there it is. Then that's going to be someone who you're never going to give someone new an opportunity. And that's often what from my colleagues, from other women, people with disability, we don't get invited into the room because it wasn't a part of culture experience. And so it's really got to be thinking outside of the box. And if there's not a diverse slate, you should keep looking. And that there should be an organization and a leadership team that understands it's going to take a bit longer, right? That it's not going to be, we're not going to rush it. If you really want to get it done and you want it to have deep roots.
There's a lot to unpack here. Emmanuel just shared that the number of female members of executive committees is actually less than 27%. In your experience, and this is a very esteemed panel, Are women breaking through? Are you seeing any tangible change? Anastasia, can you want to jump in?
Sure. So and I am loath to say how long I've been in the sports industry because translates into just how old I am. But I've been in the sports industry for 25 years, a little bit more than that now. And I will say that there has been, at least in my experience, dramatic change over that time. And I think, as Katie said a little earlier, there's this notion of being the only woman in the room. And for sure, for a very long time, I was the only woman in the room. And sometimes that translated into a badge of honor, right? When I was a young, sort of coming out into the industry, I'm the only woman in the room, and that was a great badge of honor. But it's not a well-run, workable environment to be able to thrive in. And, I've seen women breaking through at every level in sports in my time. Women are absolutely breaking through. I think where we have a lot more work to do is in retaining and developing those women who are breaking through into senior leaders. And you're seeing more and more women at the board level. You're seeing more and more women breaking into the industry. You are still seeing too few women at that C-suite level who are actually the decision makers on the day-to-day at the organizations. And I think that's someplace that we should also be focusing our efforts. I think getting more women at the board level will be a catalyst for that. But so that is a long-winded way of saying, yes, certainly women are breaking through, and organizations and conferences like this with mentoring programs are a great first step, but there's more work to do.
Yeah, and if I may jump in, I was thinking about this question, and it's kind of a sort of safe answer, yes and no, but I think it is truly yes and no. So in some ways, we have come so far, and I shared with my panelists a photo of me, coming up in the business world, and it's 2006, and it doesn't feel like it was that long ago, and the picture just gave me the visceral reaction looking back on it when I was the only one in this boardroom. So we're past that, but still to this day, every single event, there's this the first woman to coach here, or the first Black agent to coach an NFL quarterback in the Super Bowl. I think we would have made progress when we're going to stop talking about the first one. Then it's normalized. So we still have too many firsts.
I totally agree. There are still a lot of firsts. Those firsts still need to be celebrated. And we've got a keynote from the first female chair who was appointed at the English Football Association later today. I think sort of with my gold and black boots firmly on the ground with the mentees, I would say that there are a lot more young women who are conscious that want to have, they want to get to the top of the ladder and the top of their career. I would say that they sometimes feel disheartened with some of the experiences. And sometimes I feel disheartened when I listen that, some of these issues that we discuss in a safe space, like sexual harassment and discrimination, it's going on still. Young women are encountering that, and that can be a barrier, and that actually makes women drop out. And you mentioned about dropout rates. So I think getting that retention and also that visibility, because the more women that we can see that have achieved and pierced the ceiling, I think that gives hope, and it also creates a pathway. So we need to come at it from both angles.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in a little bit here. I think there's another consideration around with developing women and girls, but there's also the other piece of ensuring that we're talking about taking down the barriers, and that beyond just representation, that we're ensuring that the seat at the table is a seat that has some power. Far too often, I think folks are invited to the table, and I like to say, well, don't just give me any seat, right? If you're in a leather chair, don't give me a foldable wicker seat. I want to know that I have a seat at the table, and I cannot be the only person that knows that you've been at the table, and you're like, I might just be representation, and I'm speaking, but it's just wind, right? No one is listening.
maybe you could go a step even further. I mean, you're talking about equity systems, processes, it's beyond training. Let's dig a little deeper too, like give us some other tangible examples of what we can do to break down those barriers.
Yeah, I think anyone, any organization, any group needs to consider before, because also we bring in women, we bring in people of color, we bring in folks who've been marginalized, and then we ask them to do the heavy lifting. So there's got to be some internal conversation first with an understanding that the work will be disruptive, that it will require change and sometimes shifts in power. And that is a difficult conversation for most. We get stuck often in the hire, right? And that we talked about the hire without the considering what changes need to happen for folks to feel safe, welcome, wanted, included, valued, a sense of belonging, that if we just hire or pluck people to join the panels and groups and teams without considering what is it going to take for folks to feel welcome? So Anastasia, I see you.
Yeah, no, and I want to jump on that because I think it's so important, and you can probably all tell, we spent some time together yesterday talking through some of these issues, and I think we could talk about them for days on end. But, you know, I think what you're saying is so spot on, because it's not just the, I don't want to call them extreme, but the most awful cases of harassment, discrimination that will diminish women's feeling of self and motivation and ambition. But it's also the smaller things. And you know, people have written about this for years now. There's an interesting article this morning in Fortune talking about, you know, women will be much more likely to be given sort of the more menial tasks. Put together the project plan a party, you know, do the following things, and they will be 50 to 70% more likely to say yes, even if it's not within their job responsibilities. And it's funny, one of, you know, when I used to talk to young lawyers or young women breaking into sports, I used to say to them, and I stand by this, which is take on any task, right? Like, when you're a junior and coming in, do that work to get yourself the exposure, you know, to leadership, even if it is a thankless task. But I've been rethinking that in years. And that might be a really valuable lesson for anybody coming into a new organization, men or women. But I think that there needs to be sort of a new book of behavior and a new book of expectations when it comes to women who are in the industry, who are showing their value, who are gaining experience, where you're no longer just working harder to prove your value, you're working smarter, and you're working more strategically. And that is a place where I think mentoring can be really helpful. For sure, it's also some place where I think women are just gonna have to show their confidence. And, you know, it's an extra burden on women, but it's important. I also think that mentoring is a good first step, but mentoring is nothing without sponsorship. Because especially when you get into the C-suite level and the board level, opportunities that there's this notion of mentoring as if, you know, the women who are on that slate need to be developed. They need the skills, they need the talent. You know, I'd put forth the women, you know, have that talent. They have those skills. They have everything it takes to be in that role. They don't need more mentoring. They need a sponsor who's going to give them the opportunity. And that's where we need allies.
Yeah, I was just actually, a brilliant segue. I was going to talk about male allies, and again, it's the term that's, you know, sometimes sort of overused or feels like a cliche, but it is so important. And in fact, we need more men at conferences like this, right? Because most of the women here are, I'm sure we're preaching to the choir, but those who are not there yet are the ones who need to listen, and those men who are there and are male allies, they need to be celebrated, but importantly, they're the ones that have to do the heavy lifting of breaking down the biases and setting those examples and bringing women along. And I'm just going to give, you know, 2 examples here and how much damage sort of someone with a big platform can do. And I don't know if all of you have seen the articles that have gone viral about, you know, Tiger Woods on with the tampon antics on the golf course. That action is so damaging on so many levels, right, that you can be unpacking here for, you know, hours. But someone with a platform who can make change can also do very much damage. And again, we're talking about sort of a small joke, but in a nutshell, it sort of undermines a lot of what we're talking about here. And at the same time, there could be an action. Again, it wasn't maybe as well received, but I'm going to bring another sports story of Andy Murray hiring Amelie Mauresmo as a coach, right, with a platform that he has. While he may have been criticized, but those are the actions where he's saying, yeah, she's the best person and she can do the job, and we need more of those examples of sort of breaking down those biases and barriers.
Yeah, and sometimes it's small things that everybody who's, in the audience and watching can do. I often see, even the legal industry, it's still very male-dominated in a lot of ways, especially at the senior levels. There are so many calls where the junior person on the call is the only woman on the call. And, there is a rationale to the junior person on the call sends out the meeting invites, the junior person on the call takes the notes. But good allyship may mean that the mid-level male associate or partner will take that task on. They may not be the most junior person on the phone, but putting sort of the young women in the role of also being administrator is just bad business, and it's not good allyship. So just we can all think about those opportunities, whether we're the allies in the room or the women in the room, especially as we become more senior, saying like, hey, Joe, can you send out the meeting invite? They may not be the most junior person on the call, but let's start thinking about ways where we can elevate women so that they're not just viewed in the most administrative way.
Okay. Thank you for that. If anyone has a question, by the way, just raise your hand. Definitely want audience participation. So I have a lot more questions, though, so I'm going to continue. Next question. Do quotas, I know that's your favorite word, Olga, or metrics or targets, do they translate into meaningful change, or do they simply create artificial opportunities that are not based on merit? How do you feel? How do you feel about that?
I'll jump in on the second part, and I know that I'll let Olga take the first part. I think that I'm probably troubled by the notion that when we say targets or quotas, we automatically start to question merit, right? And instead, without the viewpoint of saying a lot of systems weren't built with women in mind, parents in mind, people of color in mind. So we're starting from behind. And that notion is not that because you're giving different people an opportunity, there should not automatically be a call or question of merit. I think it's simply about expanding and increasing the pools. And so thinking about targets and goals in a way to keep us accountable and transparent. That's really, for me, when we talk about targets and goals, because I think we talk about targets and goals with every other aspect of the business, and that is to keep us on track, to keep us moving, and to make sure that we're accountable to those targets and goals that we're setting. Otherwise, they're just wonderful mission statements, and things don't change.
Yeah, not a whole lot more to say. Very, very well said. But yeah, the word quota is not a good one. But what's get measured, get done, as they say. So measurements, metrics, goals are super important, and they're different. It's not 50-50 is not always what we have to strive for. In fact, if you probably all have heard Ruth Bader Ginsburg when she was asked, how many women on the Supreme Court is enough. She was like, well, when we get to 9, let's talk, right? So, at the Women's Sports Foundation, our board composition, we have almost 75% women, and I think we're doing pretty well. We're not, excluding men, but that works for us. And but what I did hear someone say that anything less than 30% is never going to be enough, because that's sort of the minimal critical mass that you need to feel included. So that sort of goes to that. That's like the minimum sort of standard for any diverse population you want to seek, and then you build from there. Then that builds sort of the inclusion, the belonging, and the feeling of true sort of diverse situation.
Yeah, just to add, I think the point about accountability, we might not like the words quotas, targets, but they are a useful tool to instigate change and to hold organizations accountable, as long as they're meaningful. And I think we touched on it, we want women or to include different people in the organizations that are valuable, that can make a difference. Otherwise, that's going to be counterproductive as well. And then just to share a brilliant lesson I learned last week on the mentorship program with the male allies, Dan Mannix, who's one of the founders of Underdog Venture Team, who's our official partner, he said, experience is overrated, which is something that I've never heard anyone in leadership say, which I thought was great, because he was saying about bringing different people into the conversation, which was something you touched on with the real estate anecdote.
Anything else to add, or we'll keep going?
Yeah, I mean, look, I would also, the thing I'd add is quotas or targets, they're tactics, they're part of a bigger program, and they seem to work, right? If you look at the targets that were set by, Britain's largest publicly traded company, they now have 40% of women represented on those boards in the UK. And that's not where the story should end. And those targets should be supported by other programs to make sure that it's not just diversity on the board, but inclusion on the board. So it's not just a seat at the table, but it is a meaningful role. But I do think that there is something about, sort of that, creating that change through those targets that seem to work.
So you mentioned across the pond. What about here domestically? Are there lessons that our industry can learn from other industries here? I don't know, CPG, pharma. Are there companies, are there industries doing governance better than sport is?
Yeah, so I mean, the short answer is some companies have it better figured out, some don't. I think it's really incumbent on the leaders or on the board chairs to make this a priority and to believe deeply in it, not just to check the box exercise, because that's never going to be successful. And that could breed real inequity at the company. But I do think that there are a lot of companies, whether it's in pharma, while they've not figured it out yet, I think banking is making great strides in this direction. And I think, bringing together a lot of these sort of best practices in various industry trade groups is a really smart way to get there. And the thing that I'd, sort of advise everybody in the sports industry to do is reach across to other industries and learn what their best practices are. What are they getting right? More importantly, what are they getting wrong? Sports is somewhat insular, even though it's global. Mm-hmm. So let's get those ideas on the things that are working and not working in the other industries, and see how we can apply them to ours.
Okay, so what is the governance change you'd like to make in the sports industry to create systemic, ongoing cultural change and gender equity, DEI? We'll start with you.
Yeah, so obviously a lot of different things, but I'm just going to kind of lead with one example, and let's just talk about search firms. So the definition of insanity, right? Do the same thing, expect a different result. So if the search firm does not have the track record of placing women's, why do you think it's going to be different? So looking at who you pick, then who the leaders within that search firm are, they need to look like the population. We're trying to hire more women, more people of color in those search firms, because again, those who you're looking for, they're going to be more comfortable, right? They're going to open up to those who, may look like them. And again, too many times we have made mistakes, and every time I look at it, and in the sports business, we're just repeating people look like the leaders of those organizations, and collegiate sport, athletic directors, and you just look at it and you say, you know what, like let's change things up. So to me, that's a big piece. Just try different ways you're going to approach the hiring.
From my perspective, from using the SIGA Universal Standards on Good Governance, I would say term limits. And I'd say that's what's different to sports organizations in opposed to commercial companies, because you have an elected president or a CEO, and the idea of perpetuating power. So if you change the constitution and introduce term limits for a set number of years, which is what our gold standard is, that will ensure that good governance and that there's those checks and balances in place.
I'm not often like at a loss for words, but I can't say it better than the two of you just did.
We nailed it.
Yeah, I would know that.
So last question from me. It is the International Women's Day Eve. It is International Women's Day Eve. Give a shout out to a woman who has impacted you in a very positive way, who's made a difference in your life.
Before any one of these ladies steals it, I'm going to have to give out a shout out to Billie Jean King, the one and the only, and she happens to be the founder of the Women's Sports Foundation, but probably such a role model for so many of you guys in the room and for me. And she has so many inspiring quotes. I don't even know where to start, right? Everyone knows pressure is a privilege. But the one thing I would leave you with is that she said her vision, and by the way, this is a big year for her and for gender equity. There's 50 years of equal pay at the US Open, which is incredible. The Battle of the Sexes is going to be 50 years as well, 73 Astrodome, right, Houston Astrodome, and then Billie Jean herself is turning 80, but she said her dream was always that every girl in this world has an opportunity to play and compete, that she is appreciated for her accomplishments, not just her looks, and if she's good enough, she can earn a living playing sports or doing whatever job she wants all the way to the boardroom. So admire her.
You go, because
Sure. I've got a professional and a personal, so if I can throw two out, since it's International Women's Week, we get the week. Personally, it's got to be my mom, who, and I know that sounds corny, but who, didn't go to college until she was in her late 30s while raising me by herself, and then went on to be a doctor, and she's the one who showed me you can do whatever you want to do as long as you work hard. And then professionally, I would say Amy Trask, who's the first president of an NFL team, and who I met in early 2000 when I started working at the NFL, who was a mentor before mentoring was a thing. And I am, grateful to her to this day for kind of taking a young lawyer under her wing and just kind of being kind and showing me the ropes.
Awesome. I'm going to cheat because I'm going to probably do three really quickly.
Yeah.
My mom, who, right, that's right. My mom who, my mother and father raised 6 children, but my mom could have been a military sergeant, right? Like warm, welcoming, just a superhero of mine. And so she's 84 years young and amazing. So I got to shout out Dorothy Edwards. And then the other 2 people really quickly are Cent Marshall, CEO of Dallas Mavericks, who I think is just amazing. And if you haven't read her book, read it. She's like super, I'm a fangirl Cent, so looking to meet you. And Allison Desir, who authored Running While Black. I met her recently in the last 2 or 3 years, and I just think her courage, bravery, the way that she always speaks truth and power and love, and I think she's amazing. So,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Are there any questions before we move on to the next panel?
Well, thank you all so much. Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much. This has been so insightful. We really appreciate your time today. So something that kind of blew my mind when Erica was talking about that example of the real estate talk at breakfast and your quote of, experience is overrated. I'm just thinking to myself, like, as a hiring manager, I will admit you're always looking for merit and experience, someone who can be the most productive and hit the ground running so that you can then be the most productive. So my question is, how would you think about ways that organizations can structure themselves to incentivize this process of looking at someone who's more of a long-term great hire with mentorship and coaching that obviously is going to take more time off your plate, to have that long-term vision versus the short-term of like someone who can get in there, has the right experience, has done the job before, and like I said, can hit the ground running.
You, me?
Yeah, go for it.
Part of that, I think, is like culture shift. And there's a phrase recently I heard in a training around allowing people to stand on the balcony for a bit before they get on the dance floor. And that so they get to observe. And I in a previous place I worked, that they would say to you when you came in, it's going to take you 6 months to feel like you know what's going on here. Take the time. And so that is easier said than done when everything is moving this quickly. So it's often, if you can focus on what those transferable skills are, we talk about that what's the nice to have versus what's the need to have. And if you can distinguish the two, if the person has the ability, the willingness to learn, that's fantastic. But we also have to have a culture shift within the org to say we need to give people time to just kind of get their legs in a space. And I think that is, again, that is a great in theory and much harder to do. It takes a bit of a culture shift.
Yeah, and men are often hired on potential and women on performance. So we can turn that around and we'll be just fine.
Yeah.
Fake it till you make it.
Well, thank you so much for a meaningful discussion.
Thank
And
you.
back to you, Bonnie. Floor is yours.
Jill, thank you. I'd like to touch on a couple of things before we move on to our next panel. Anastasia mentioned Amy Trask, who to date is the only female CEO of an NFL team. I'm not at all about shameless self-promotion, but there's a new podcast dropping on Audible, which is, you can get it globally. It's called She Got Game. And Amy Trask happens to be one of our guests. Amy was an equestrian growing up, and she talks about teamwork, but she also talks about working for the Raiders. And if you're not familiar with the Raiders, whether it's the Oakland or the LA version, Al Davis, who is one of the great patriarchs of the NFL, was one of the notoriously toughest owners out there. And so if you're looking for inspiration, Amy is an extraordinary inspiration. The comment that Katie shared about experience being overrated is such a valuable conversation to have. I do a lot of stuff in college athletics. I can tell you that there are athletics directors at some of the biggest universities across the country who have not followed the traditional administrative track to be an athletic director. There are conference commissioners in college who have no experience in the college game. And I don't say that at all to disqualify them. What I'm sharing is that valuable skill sets are valuable skill sets. They don't necessarily have to be achieved in industry. The other thing is there are tangible qualifications and intangible qualifications. The tangible qualifications are what are going to show up on your resume or your CV. The intangible things are things that you are born with, that you inherently possess: drive, ambition, the willingness to be a great teammate, getting out of bed every day with the commitment to yourself and everybody around you to be the best version of yourself and the best version for your teammates. You can't put that on a resume. And that's why the interviewing process for employee candidates is so critical, because that is your opportunity as the person doing the hiring to just get a window into who the person is. They may not necessarily have the CV or the resume you're looking for, but you should be able to tell by the way you conduct that conversation in the room whether that person, based on their ambition, their passion, their willingness to learn, and what they see on their CV, whether they are a right fit for your organization. So I hope during our breaks and during conversations after this conference that y'all continue to have that conversation, because this is a critical one in our march toward equity.